This is my bio. I do a lot of things. I spent 20 years in tech. I was a serial software entrepreneur, and I learned about investing in early stage companies by creating them all in Seattle, all backed by VCs in California, except the very first one, which was backed by a excessively wealthy person from Singapore, an angel who wrote a single check, the scale of VC checks. And then I made a big shift in 2012. I started a business accelerator called Fledge. It's impact focused. I'll tell you about that in a second. And it has a bunch of spin-offs, but I'm not pitching here today, so I'm going to skip that and teach you something about impact measurement. So next slide. And this goes back 100 and something years. It goes back to 1889 is when it got published, right? The idea is a little older than that. But this is it's the idea that Andrew Carnegie came up with, which is that the right way to do this is that you get rich and then you give it away. And I say it the right way, kind of air quotes, because that's an invented idea. Before that, the idea was you get rich and you give some to charity. But his idea was you give it all away. So next slide. And we know exactly what his beliefs were because he wrote it down in 1889 in an article in a magazine. It was called Wealth. It's now called The Gospel of Wealth. And you can read it. It's dated. But basically, that's where he's saying that if you die rich, you're doing it wrong. You should be considered a failure if you have died rich. You have to give it away before you die. Next slide. All right, so we have this landscape here of make as much money as possible and then give it away. Next slide. And what Carnegie did to do this was he created Carnegie Steel right when, perfect timing. Timing is most everything. He did this at the peak of the Industrial Revolution when steel was what was needed to build the railroads and the factories and the cars and everything else. He sold it to J.P. Morgan in 1901, which became part of U.S. Steel. Carnegie had more money than Bezos, Gates, and Musk combined. You can probably take, the equivalent would be take the top 15 wealthiest people in the country. That's the kind of the scale of the wealth he had. And then he gave it away. And he couldn't give it away by creating a foundation because they didn't exist. Nonprofits didn't exist because taxes didn't exist yet. Right? Income taxes came later. So he created a series of companies to give away the money. Most famous is the Carnegie Corporation, which funded 10,000, 20,000 libraries around the world. And most dear to my heart is Carnegie Mellon, which is a school that I attended as an undergrad. All right, next slide. So going back, and the consequence of this, of Carnegie's move, Carnegie's idea here, is that the big ideas, the big problems of the world, poverty, hunger, health, environment, whatnot, the consequence is we turn to the philanthropists to solve those problems. And we do that because others followed in his footsteps and they created foundations. And so we still have the Rockefeller Foundation giving away Rockefeller money. And if you go look at the list of the 100 biggest foundations, you'll find of the 100, it seems like 89 of them were entrepreneurial money, right? You find Johnson's money from Johnson & Johnson. You find Ford Foundation, you find the creators of Eli Lilly and Merck and all these other companies out there, their money turned into foundations, and those foundations are solving these problems. And we then just think that's the area that the philanthropists have to go solve, and they don't have enough money to do that. We need to use the for-profit means to go solve it because there's just way more money and more power on the for-profit side. I have a whole other talk on that. Next slide. All right, so I put these in the corner. Go to the next slide after this, because these are related. So we think of investing in philanthropy as two different things in two different pockets. We think we're supposed to go make money on Wall Street, and then we're supposed to give 10% of it away as philanthropy. But in fact, go to the next slide. They're on a continuum, and the continuum goes like this. Up and down is how much return do you expect? So when you invest, you expect the most return possible, or the most return given the risk as possible. And when you give your money away as philanthropy, you don't expect any actual financial return. It's 100% loss, right? If you think of it as investing, it's 100% loss. But the reason why you do philanthropy is on the next slide, and that's the horizontal axis, which is how much impact do you want to have? And we're using that word, the word impact investing is only like 15, 20 years old. The word impact has a lot of other meanings to it. But in this case, we just mean solving real problems. So when you put your money in philanthropy, the reason you do it is to maximize the impact and no return. And when you pick a stock on Wall Street, most people could care less what the impact is, right? Some people do ESG and whatnot, but most money out there in Wall Street, in bonds and whatnot, is just trying to make a return. All right, so the next slide shows those two axes. And the next slide shows where impact investing falls, which is pretty much everything in between maximizing your return and getting no return at all. Everything else is impact investing. And there's a white space down in the bottom left corner because, next slide, that corner means I purposely went out to have no impact and lose my money. Like, nobody chooses to go in that corner. We wind up in that corner because a lot of the things that we invest in as impact investors turn out not to have any, turn out to fail and therefore not have any impact. And so in the end, a lot of investments might wind up in that corner, but nobody picks that corner to aim for. In the bottom right corner on the next slide is what a lot of us call concessionary returns. So this is the idea. A friend of mine runs a fund in Portland called Beneficial Returns. It promises to return like 2% to its investors. Risk return wise, that doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't do that, except a lot of people do because of the impacts that they're making. They in fact spun up a fund last year that was pandemic mitigation, and they promised to lose 2%. So again, if you think of the frame as philanthropy loses 100%, and this trust fund that they spun up promised to only lose 2%, to give you back, 98% at best, maybe 95% of your money, that's a great investment as a philanthropist. As an investor, not so much. So then there's another corner in the top right, go next slide, which is where my work is aiming for and my friends at Capri are aiming for. Capri is a network of impact funds around the world. We're trying to make money and have impact at the same time. This is the corner I also often called cake, right? I want the cake and I want to eat it too. I want a really nice return and I want a really good impact. And I want to get as far close to that top right corner as possible. But if I wind up in the middle, I'm fine, right? If I get my money back with 25% on top or 50% on top, right? If I can double my money, that's great. And have an impact, that's great. And then the next slide shows the top left corner, which is I want to have impact, right? I want to screen for impact and make sure my investments have an impact, but I'm not trying to maximize that. I'm trying to still maximize my return. And the best example I have for this is called IX Invests. It's a holding company started by the grandson of Warren Buffett. This is Howard Warren Buffett's holding company. I'm an investor in it because it's got a Buffett name on it. I'm really interested to see what they do. There's a whole bunch of funds in the impact space that fall into this top left corner. Okay, next slide. And to finish up here, we think of for-profits and nonprofits with that same lens. We talk about them with the same lens. We talk about for-profits exist to maximize their returns, right, to maximize shareholder value. I have another talk on that. And we think of nonprofits as philanthropists that lose their money. But next slide, reality looks like this. There are for-profits that are trying to solve real problems. There are nonprofits that are revenue-driven, where all or most of their money comes in from revenues. They overlap. The overlapping area are hybrid companies sometimes that run both a for-profit and a nonprofit. And then the final slide here is impact investing can be into all of these. So just because it's a nonprofit doesn't mean it's not investable. Just because it's a for-profit doesn't mean it doesn't have any impact. And so the complexities of impact investing come from the fact that it's not one of these 2 points in the corner, it's this big wide landscape. And therefore it's really hard to describe, what is it that you're trying to accomplish unless you have a landscape like this and you can point to it and say, well, I'm aiming for this corner, and therefore here's what falls out of that strategy. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.